The passengers in first class shifted uncomfortably as a flight attendant leaned over a tall black man in an impeccable navy suit, her voice sharp but fake polite. "Sir, this seat is for premium guests only." He handed her his ticket again, calm but cold inside. The murmurs began, judging eyes, whispers, questioning how he even got there. What no one knew was that the man they were humiliating was the very person their company answered to, and within half an hour the entire airline would come to a stop. Watch until the end. Wait a second. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Ethan Grant wasn't the kind of man who flaunted success. At 42, he was the quiet architect behind one of the biggest corporate takeovers in aviation history. Years of perseverance, sleepless nights, and ignored prejudice had shaped him into a leader who believed in letting results speak for themselves. That morning, he boarded the flight from Dallas to New York for what was supposed to be a routine trip, an internal audit, a few meetings, nothing special. He carried only a laptop bag and a folder of reports. To most, he looked like any other business traveler. But for Ethan, flying first class wasn't a luxury. It was efficiency, a brief window to breathe between chaos. He didn't expect the trip to test not his patience, but his dignity. He didn't know that the real turbulence wouldn't come from the sky, but from the people sitting around him. The cabin doors were still open when it started. A young flight attendant approached, her smile brittle. "Sir, may I see your ticket?" Ethan looked up, puzzled but obliging. She scanned it, frowned, and said softly, "This section is for first-class passengers." "Coach is behind you." A few heads turned. The businessman beside him glanced away. A woman across the aisle whispered something to her husband. Ethan calmly replied, "There must be a mistake." He had flown this airline hundreds of times. His name was printed in bold on the manifest, Ethan A. Grant, Chief Executive Officer of Aero World Holdings, the parent company that had just acquired this airline 3 months ago. But the attendant wasn't convinced. She called her supervisor. The supervisor came, older, sterner, and with that same subtle disbelief that black excellence often encounters. "Sir, unless you can prove this seat is yours, I'll have to ask you to move." Ethan handed over his boarding pass again, his voice even. Around him, passengers muttered, pretending to be polite but savoring the drama. "Probably a last-minute upgrade," someone said. Another laughed. "He's trying his luck." Inside, Ethan felt something familiar, rage wrapped in resignation. He'd seen it in boardrooms, in negotiations, even in restaurants when he picked up the check. That instinctive doubt, the kind that questioned his right to be anywhere above average. He could have ended it right there, revealed who he was. But he waited. Sometimes exposure works better in silence. When the captain was informed of the issue, he came out himself, clipboard in hand. "We can sort this out, sir," he said firmly, not meeting Ethan's eyes. Ethan stood and handed over his ID, a black leather card embossed with the airline's parent company's logo. The captain froze. Then, as his eyes lifted to the name, his expression cracked. "Mr. Grant?" The cabin went silent. Phones tilted upward. The attendants' faces drained of color. Ethan didn't shout. He didn't curse. He said, "Please return to your duties." Then he sat back down, folded his hands, and looked out the window. 28 minutes later, as the plane still sat motionless on the tarmac, a message arrived. All flights under the carrier were to remain grounded, pending an internal misconduct review. The silence that followed was deafening. When the plane finally disembarked, Ethan walked through the terminal without a word. The airline released an apology within hours, a misunderstanding, they called it. But the footage had already spread online. The attendants' tones, the passengers' stares, the quiet humiliation of a man who owned the very company they disrespected. Ethan didn't seek revenge. He sought reform. Within weeks, mandatory bias training was implemented across all branches. The 2 attendants were suspended, the captain reassigned, but more importantly, thousands began to talk about what happened that day, because it wasn't just about one man's seat, it was about the thousands denied dignity in places where they rightfully belonged. How many more misunderstandings before respect stops being a privilege and becomes a given? Where are you watching from? Your city, your country. Ethan stayed quiet as the flight attendants fumbled with apologies, their words tripping over one another. The irony stung. Their sudden politeness wasn't born of respect, but fear. Around him, the same passengers who'd watched with judgment now avoided eye contact. One woman pretended to scroll through her phone, pretending she hadn't called him entitled minutes earlier. Another man mumbled, "Didn't know he was important, important." That word echoed in his mind like a bruise. Wasn't every passenger entitled to the same courtesy, the same presumption of belonging? Why did it take wealth or status to command simple respect? As the plane taxied back to the gate, Ethan recalled the many flights he'd taken long before success, those cramped economy seats where attendants ignored his call light, the suspicious looks at security, the quiet apologies that never meant anything. He had thought money, power, and a polished name could shield him. Today reminded him it couldn't. Inside the terminal, he moved through the crowd with deliberate calm. His assistant, waiting by the lounge entrance, looked startled when she saw his face. "Sir, your meeting, it's postponed," he said evenly. "We have another priority now." Within minutes, his message was sent directly to the airline board. He didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten lawsuits or headlines. He attached the time-stamped footage from the cabin, recorded by 3 passengers, and wrote one line, "Let's make sure no one ever feels unwelcome on a plane we own." What followed was swift. Public outrage grew by the hour, fueled by disbelief that someone of his stature could still face such treatment. But beneath the outrage lay something deeper, recognition. For many, it wasn't a shock. It was validation of what they'd known all along. Ethan watched the coverage that night from his hotel room, the city lights flickering through the glass. His name trended globally, but he found no satisfaction in it. He thought that his father, who used to drive trucks for the same airline decades ago, was denied promotions despite having a perfect record. He thought of his mother, who worked nights so he could study, telling him, "You'll have to be twice as good to get half as far." She was right. He had been. The next morning, the airline released a new diversity and inclusion policy, drafted personally under Ethan's supervision. Every employee, from gate staff to executives, would undergo sensitivity and ethics training. Complaints of bias would go directly to an independent board. Anonymous channels were opened for passengers to report discrimination without fear of reprisal. Some called it damage control. Ethan called it the start of accountability. Weeks later, during a press conference, a journalist asked him if he regretted what happened that day. Ethan paused before answering. "Regret?" he said. "No. I regret that it had to happen at all. But if humiliation is the price for progress, I'll pay it again." He didn't mention the letters he'd received, hundreds of them. From passengers, pilots, and even janitors. People who'd been overlooked, spoken down to, or dismissed because of how they looked. Ethan smiled faintly as he read them. Not because the pain was gone, but because it meant people were finally speaking up. That flight had never taken off. Yet somehow it had carried millions forward, and as he boarded another plane weeks later, greeted this time with genuine respect, he knew the turbulence wasn't behind him. It was just beginning to clear. Stories like this remind us that respect should never depend on color or status. It should be the rule, not the exception. Where are you watching from? Take care.